Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for calling in. We're going to get started in just another minute. Okay, good afternoon and welcome, everyone. Sylvia, next slide, please. Welcome to the webinar, Measuring Apprenticeship Completions. Today, we're going to be discussing how states should count apprenticeships towards their state post-secondary attainment goals, and then delve in a little bit into how Iowa and Washington have actually collected this data about apprentices that they can use to count progress towards those goals. At the end, we're going to have a question and answer period. So if you'd like to ask a question, please use the question and answer box. It's a Q inside of a square located in the toolbar at the bottom of your screen. The toolbar will disappear after inactivity on your computer, so if you need to use the toolbar, just move your cursor to locate it. For most people, again, it's going to be at the bottom. You can ask questions throughout the webinar, and they will be answered at the end, as many as we can get to. So hopefully after this webinar, if you're a state employee, you're going to have a better understanding of how to collect data on registered apprenticeships. The rest of you will hopefully better understand how states can move this ball forward. Sylvia, next slide, please. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Workforce Data Quality Campaign, the Workforce Data Quality Campaign is a project of the National Skills Coalition. So the NSC, we build coalitions to advance a middle skills agenda, and WDQC refers to ourselves as the data branch of national skills. We advocate for better data at the state and federal levels to narrow the middle skills gap and provide stakeholders with the information that they need to make good decisions. Next slide. Again, as an overview, I'm going to start off today with a little bit of background about why states should include registered apprenticeships within their post-secondary attainment goals. And then in order for states to count progress towards these goals and better understand if apprenticeships are equitable, what their outcomes are, and also to promote data-driven state policies, we're going to discuss how states can get and use data about registered apprenticeship programs. Next slide. I'm thrilled to be able to welcome our panelists today. We have Greg Wilson from the U.S. Department of Labor, Ryan Murphy from Iowa Workforce Development, and Dave Wallace from the Washington Workforce Training and Education Coordinating Board. So thank you all, gentlemen, for being on this webinar today. Next slide, please. So as background, I think a lot of you on this webinar are here because you know that states are facing a huge skills gap. There just aren't enough trained workers for available jobs. And so if we want to start thinking creatively about how to meet that demand for trained workers, a lot of states are establishing post-secondary attainment goals. These goals are going to outline the number or perhaps percentage of people that are trying to earn some sort of post-secondary credential. And usually they're indicative, these credentials, of being trained and ready to succeed in a particular job. A lot of the jobs that are in that gap area where there isn't enough trained workers are middle skill jobs, and they're going to require more than high school diploma but less than a 4-year degree. So when states are creating their post-secondary attainment goals, they're thinking more creatively about not just associate's and bachelor's degrees, but what other types of credentials can train people for these good jobs. So apprentices, it's pretty well proven how successful they are. They have 90% of apprentices are actually retained by the company that they apprenticed with. They have average starting wages of over $60,000 a year. And because apprenticeships are created by industry groups that are looking to hire skilled workers, they're pretty naturally tailored to the needs of employers and industries. And in fact, for every single dollar invested in apprenticeship training right now, employers are receiving an average benefit of $1.47. So they're getting an almost 50% of return on investment in training apprentices. I think it's pretty clear, really, given the stats about how successful apprenticeships are, that they're one way to really get at not only meeting your post-secondary attainment goal, but narrowing that skills gap and making sure that citizenry is well-trained, earning a good living, and that employers have the workforce that they need. Next slide, please. a little bit of background here about the data landscape of registered apprenticeships. So if a state has a post-secondary attainment goal and they actually want to know how many people are meeting it and how many people are earning registered apprenticeship certificates, they're going to need data about those apprentices. And so usually apprenticeship sponsors are going to provide information about an apprentice, perhaps an apprentice's demographic information like their age, race, gender, the program, the apprenticeship program, who the related training provider is, as well as completion information, so whether they achieved an apprenticeship certificate or still in progress, left the program, etc. So how the process is for getting apprenticeship data is going to depend based on how a state's registered apprenticeship programs are administered. In about half of states, registered apprenticeships are administered through a state apprenticeship agency, so it's a state agency that has control over registering apprenticeships and collecting all of that data. In the other half of states, the U.S. Department of Labor's Office of Apprenticeship oversees registration. So today's webinar, we're lucky enough to have a state apprenticeship agency state, Washington, to talk about their data, as well as a DOL-administered state, Iowa, to talk about how they're getting apprenticeship data from the Department of Labor, since they don't have it naturally within states. So in terms of what states have data right now, we can see that there's definitely room for improvement in a lot of states. According to a WDQC survey that we released last year, 27 states have most or all data about registered apprenticeship programs. So the rest of these states don't have a particularly good idea of how many of their residents are enrolled in and completing registered apprenticeships. So there's still a good amount of work to be done in this space, even though a lot of states have started to make progress. Once states have this data, it's really helpful for them to add it to what's called their state longitudinal data systems. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with that term, essentially that allows states to really utilize the data that they are already collecting by matching data from different agencies, different programs over time. So essentially, you can use it to follow an individual's progress from K-12 into post-secondary education and training, and then eventually into the workforce and to understand where they're working and how much money they're earning. Sometimes these systems also contain information about social service programs. So once you have that data in your SLDS, it allows you to do a couple of things. A really big one in terms of measuring credential attainment is that you're going to have all that information about what credentials people are earning in one place. So it's easier to count, but it's also easier to get a non-duplicated count. So if someone is earning a certificate and then later a license, and then maybe after that they go back to school and get a degree, you don't want to count that person 3 times. And so if it's in the SLDS, that allows you to count one person with multiple certifications and only once. It's also just generally helpful to better understand employment outcomes and compare with other education and training programs what apprenticeships are doing. You can understand how apprenticeships are fitting into overall workforce and education strategies. Ultimately, you can kind of help policymakers get the information they need to design and fund the most effective programs. Educators and trainers can adjust their programs based on outcomes if they're not getting the kind of outcomes they think they should be. The data can help them figure that out to make changes. And then students too. Students can use the data that comes out of these systems to figure out what program is the best for them and what will meet their needs. And then if this data includes demographic information, so again, the student's age, race, gender, ethnicity, states can better understand if programs are serving all of the groups of interest equally well. So if they're serving people of color or people with limited English proficiency. And ultimately, this information is going to help states know if there's equitable attainment in the state, or if they need to do something policy-wise to improve equity. Next slide, please. So I've talked a little bit about the sort of broad value of apprenticeships, but I'm curious to hear our panelists' take on this. They're why you're all tuned in today. So Ryan, I know that Iowa includes apprenticeships within the state post-secondary attainment goal, and I presume that the reason for this is because Iowa thinks that apprenticeships clearly have value in the labor market, but can you talk a little bit more about that from your state's perspective?
Sure, thank you. Thanks for having me today. One reason that we are concerned with registered apprenticeships in Iowa is we know that a lot of the jobs in our state, high demand occupations, have registered apprenticeship programs. And also, when we're talking about post-secondary educational goals, we want to look at, as you said, not only those that are 2-year and 4-year, but those post-secondary attainment that lead to quality employment. And when we do our analysis here in Iowa, we look at the educational makeup of the population we have here, 25 and older, and a majority of the people, for us to reach that educational attainment goal of 70% of Iowans to have some post-secondary education or training by 2025, which we call the Future Ready Iowa initiative, we're going to need to reach out to adults. And adults typically have bills. Adults typically have mortgages or rent and utility, food, that kind of thing that they need to take care of. And Registered Apprenticeship offers them a way to earn. Obviously, why they learn, we've heard it over and over. And so that's one reason that we are focusing on that, because for us to attain that educational attainment goal, we need to be able to reach adults and upskill them and that's whether they have not had any experience in post-secondary education or training, or have had some but didn't complete that post-secondary education or training. So that's one reason that we are concerned here in Iowa with Registered Apprenticeships. It's a very good program for that. Wanted to point out that we are using, as part of a scholarship program for Future Ready Iowa, we looked at the occupations again that have those registered apprenticeship programs, and wanted to make sure that we are including those in the discussion for scholarships and grants to help employers and employees make that an incentive for them as well.
Thanks, Ryan. I think it's also helpful to hear about this from the federal context. So we have Greg on from the U.S. Department of Labor, and our federal team talks about this all the time. This past few years, Congress and the administration, they've invested really heavily in apprenticeships. So Greg, do you want to talk a little bit about what those investments are, some of the federal action on apprenticeships right now, and kind of why you think they were made? Presumably it's because someone in the federal government thinks this information is great. And Sylvia, I think next slide, Greg has some slides on this.
Okay, thank you, Jenna. Yeah, again, just on the slide to point out that we have seen a investment by Congress and the President to expand the reach of apprenticeship across the nation. We have a new programmatic funding stream, and you can see the dollar values that are listed there. We received $90 million in FY or fiscal year 16, $95 million in fiscal year 17, $145 million this fiscal year 2018. That money is used partly to focus on industry expansion, funding to our state partners to also promote apprenticeships. So we're excited to have these extra funding power in which to expand apprenticeships reach across the nation. And you can see part of it is, increasing awareness of apprenticeship as a post-secondary benefit. We're doing, launching a new website. We've also have a new tool for finding apprenticeships. And another news, we're seeing our other funding sources in the Department of Labor being made available for scaling apprenticeships through different grant funding opportunities. So we're just really excited to be a program that's in the spotlight, growing, diversifying into new industries and new occupations. So it's really just an exciting time for us here in the apprenticeship world. Next slide. So just so you can see that these investments really are paying off. This year, there were over 238,000 new registered apprenticeships, participants who began their registered apprenticeship. That's actually a 20-year high. So we really have been growing. These numbers you're seeing are focused in the registered apprenticeship world. So that's exciting. If I go to the next slide real briefly. We've had it, again, since we kind of began growing, the attention that was placed on apprenticeships starting around 2013, we've seen a 56% growth in apprenticeship, a registered apprenticeship system across the nation and apprenticeship as a whole. So, you know, we're real excited. The number of people participating in an apprenticeship right now, it's over 585,000 participants. So again, we have grown. We've expanded from what used to be traditionally a construction-based program to many other industries, particularly healthcare, finance, and even IT. So you know, we couldn't do it without the help of our state partners or the federal staff that are involved, as we are sort of a partnership between states and the federal government. Next slide. So as we are moving to expand registered apprenticeship, I just want to end on this slide and say that we have our traditional registered apprenticeship program. We're proud at its growth. We continue to support it. It is our one of our flagship products. We are also moving into another flagship product, which is our industry recognized apprenticeship program. That's something that is growing. If you want to know more information on that new program, you want to go to our apprenticeship.gov website to learn more about it. But the focus of the data and the discussion today is on the registered apprenticeship side. And that's it for me, Jenna, on those slides.
Thanks, Greg. Yeah, I think we are focusing on registered apprenticeships today because that's what's been in existence for a couple of years, and that's what a lot of the data currently exists about. So actually, Greg, I think I want to start our panel discussion with you again, since you've just kind of laid out the federal side of things and shown how apprenticeship is it's growing, it's a federal priority. I think, can you talk a little bit about, I think it's hard for the general public to kind of understand. They hear the word data, it sounds kind of amorphous, it sounds kind of scary. You're like, what is this happening? So I think it might be helpful if you can talk a little bit about what data sponsors provide to the U.S. Department of Labor. So like what you actually can tell about an apprentice from the data, and you know, what's generally collected. And then if I think you might be able to do a screen share of some websites to show that, but I think that's helpful for people. Like, I know that when I see that crystallized, when I see what the system looks like, I'm like, oh, I understand. This is much more basic than it seems.
Mm-hmm. So I am sharing my screen, and this is just to start off real quickly. This is our apprenticeship.gov website, which is our new website for promotion and the latest information on registered apprenticeship. But for the data right now, I'm going to go to what is our Employment and Training Administration website, where we have under our resource page, we have a data page here called Data and Statistics. And here is the page. I have to update it with the current year's data, but so the growth rate has increased. This is our old growth rate, but what you see here is our data that we basically have is we have available for the national level is, you know, active apprentices, new, the completers, the programs, and the new programs. And then we have a breakdown of the data by state, such as the breakdown of the data by state. And then because we are a system that is partly state-run and partly federal-run, I don't, unfortunately, get a uniform data set at this time, although we are working to obtain records from our state partners in which to build a better national picture. But I do also break down at least the data that are collected in the 25 what are called federally administrated states, the ones that are run by federal staff. We do break down the data a little bit more granularly into the different top occupations, such as, you know, electricians and boilermakers, firefighters, and so forth, and in the top industries that participate in the program. That is available on our website. And then to get individual record information and more granular data, That's available upon request through our apprenticeship.ithelp@dol.gov website. We are able to provide a more granular view of the data. And we're able to provide out some of that data. Does that answer your question, Jenna?
Yeah, I think actually what you raise is a really important point, because the administration of apprenticeships is kind of segmented. It's really hard to know what's happening on a national scale. There isn't necessarily comprehensive data about the state-run programs and the federal programs all in one place. And so it's a little bit of a segmented way to figure out what's happening on a national policy scale. I think I would be interested, yeah, so you have the RAPIDS website up now.
Mm-hmm.
Why don't you run users briefly through that so that they can see, hey, I'm an apprenticeship sponsor. I'm running an apprenticeship program. Here's the information that I actually wind up giving to the Department of Labor.
Okay. So the way it works is, again, because we don't pay our program sponsors, we have limited data collection. So what we collect on apprentices is really at the start of their participation, and then we get the outcome of did they complete or cancel. So when you go to, for example, I'll take up an apprentice. So what I'm showing right now real quickly is the data that we have available to download and give out to the public, which is those individual record files that don't contain our personal identifiable information. But I'm bringing up a new page. It's going to load for a second here. So this is what we collect on an apprentice, and I'm just going to pick a program real quickly here. So we collect, their first name, their last name, the basic demographics. Whoops. Social Security is optional. But we collect that, and if we get the Social Security number, we can do outcome matches to get outcome post-apprenticeship.
And to clarify what that means for folks,
yeah,
can eventually use that to look through and find out what happens to the apprentice after their apprenticeship is completed, after 6 months, after a year, after 10 years. They can know if they're still working with the same employer that they apprenticed with, what their wage progression has been. It could also help find that person if for some reason they went back to get additional training. But it's essentially what helps you. That Social Security number is really essential in the data world for finding a person in other data sets.
Yep. And then we collect basic demographic information, ethnicity, race. It can be multi-race, veteran status, education level at time of participation, disability status, and then if they've had a connection into the systems, like a pre-apprenticeship. Then they're registered into an occupation. The occupation of the apprentice is associated with the program they're being registered into. So the program has to register with us first before they register their apprentices. The particular example I chose randomly is a refrigeration program. They can have, this program is 10,000 hours, but if they have previous experience, they can shorten the length of that training. These are all predetermined at the time the program is registered. I'm really skipping some steps just to kind of do this real briefly. And then, so they have their occupation, they have a wage schedule they follow. An entry wage. Let's see. And then that's the basic information we collect on an apprentice. So let me just show you what an apprentice agreement looks like real quickly? So I'm going to say, okay, I'm not going to say
Yeah, and
that.
before you move on, do you just want to mention, I think for people in the crowd to see this, this is really the system that you're only going to see as a sponsor. Like, this isn't something that a Joe Schmo can pull up from the internet and see. They're not going to be able to see every apprentice's information and social security number, right? Like, this is pretty limited.
This is very limited. This is not a reporting system. This is a case management system. So everyone has a user account to get on here. And it is used to register and track programs and apprentices. Reporting is a secondary feature of the system. So I'm just going to go into a program real quickly just to show what an apprentice agreement looks like. So you take up a registered apprentice. I'm going to bring up an apprentice and just bring up the agreement to show what it looks like. And this is the contract, basically, between the employer and the participant, and it looks like this. So what I try to go through real quickly, the flow on how to register. This is what occurs once they're registered. This document is produced. And that's the apprenticeship agreement. And that's really the primary purpose of our program. So you're collecting information about what occupation they're in, who they are, who the participant is, and then we ask after they've been in the program, we ask if they've completed or canceled as an outcome from the program. So that's really the information we're collecting.
So all this information, if you're one of the 25 or so Office of Apprenticeship administered states, you're not going to have any of this information about your apprentices within your state. I think a lot of these states are like, you know, I don't actually know how many apprentices I have in my state. So the Department of Labor actually has a process to give this data back to state agencies that want to better understand, you know, how many apprentices they have and what fields they're in. Can you talk a little bit about that process to share this information with states? And later we're going to ask Ryan and Iowa to share this from their perspective as well. But, you know, can you share how a state that really wants to get this data can do so?
So, like I said, if people are interested in individual records that don't contain the personal identifiable information, then that's just an email to us, and we provide that information. But for those states that are interested in getting back data that contains sensitive things such as the Social Security number, the names of the apprentice, their birth dates, and so forth, they have to commit to a data comply with the data sharing agreement. And I know, Jenna, I provided you an example of one with the state of Michigan, and hopefully that's a part of the attachments to this webinar. But once they enter into a data sharing agreement, then they have the ability to download their state's data directly out of the system that includes all the PII information. And that's something we have in place with the state of Iowa. So Iowa gets back the data that is entered into the system through that data sharing agreement. And basically, they come in here and we set up their account. So I go to Iowa, and the system generates the data and a password. And then we set up the user accounts. And then separately, we provide them with a PIN that changes on a regular basis. So it's two-part authentication. The system sends them a password for the data, but they have to call and talk to us to get the PIN to access the data. But on a quarterly basis, starting actually just this past Monday, Iowa is now able to go in and get their data through that data sharing agreement and have access to the data, including the Social Security numbers, in which to do the wage record matching, in which to connect it to other data sources in the state. So it's a real powerful tool that we're just rolling out this week.
That's exciting. So Ryan, I'm interested to get your perspective on this. You know, we just heard from Greg that essentially you can sign a contract if you're a state and you're interested in getting this data. But will you talk about, you know, how that whole process went for you from start to finish, how it was initiated and how long it took, and sort of some of the details from your end?
Sure, I'll do my best. Iowa's had an agreement with the Department of Labor Office of Apprenticeship since 2009. So we've been getting our state data for almost a decade. And that was prior to my time in this position. I don't know if Greg was there when we first started to or not, but we work through our state representative. So we have a state officer here, Greer Sisson is her name, and work closely with her and started with her, letting her know that what we wanted to, our goal was what we wanted to do. And then she put us in touch with the DC office. And that's when we started working through at that time, 2009, there was only there was the data sharing MOU. This last update that we had of when Rapids 2.0 came out in the spring, we already had a relationship with Greg. We had gone back and forth and done multiple agreement renewals before. But, and Greg can correct me if I'm wrong, but this is one of the first times that, I think it's actually the second, that we've had what's called an interconnection security agreement, which is separate from the data sharing MOU, which has what data will be shared and that you're going to protect it with your processes and what it can be used for, the purpose and the duration. The interconnection security agreement actually, if you want to go up to the next slide. Sure. The interconnection security agreement is more of an agreement that says your IT systems are secure enough to handle our data, to house our data. And so when I was working with DOL on this, we worked closely with our IT department on this interconnection security agreement because they're speaking a language that I'm not familiar with. I don't work on that side of our agency. And so our Chief Information Officer and her staff went through that agreement while analysts and our attorneys went through the memorandum of understanding on the data side. And so both of those we came to reviewed, signed, and then submitted that back to Greg at the DOL Office of Apprenticeship, and then worked back and forth on a couple of adjustments that additional purposes that we would like to add into that data sharing agreement. And so we've had that in place since, I believe, spring of last year, the newest one, and the duration is for 3 years. And so if there aren't any changes to the usage or the purpose, then we'll be in touch with Greg again, probably 9 months or so before that MOU expires, and look at getting a renewal in place so that we don't have a lapse in coverage. And on the technical side, when I was putting together my slides, we were doing a quarterly data request from Greg's team. So we would submit an email requesting Iowa's data. And so as Greg mentioned, this week was the first we've had the ability to go out to the DOL site and get our own data extracts from them. Actually, this morning was the first time that one of our analysts, Jason Crowley, was able to do that and said it worked great, and it was a very smooth and slick process. And so we're looking forward to that, being able to do that.
So Ryan, I know that one of you mentioned going back and forth with DOL a couple of times, and one of the times that you did that, it was so that your Iowa's Department of Education, who holds your state longitudinal data system, could also have access to some of this information, right? So I guess I'm curious to hear, why you wanted to share this data with the Department of Education and how that could be beneficial for other states to have more than one agency have access to this.
Sure. So one of the purposes that we added in this last round was allowing us to share this with our Department of Education, who houses our state longitudinal data system. And one of their reports that they have is called the Post-Secondary Readiness Report. In that report, they look at the number of high school graduates who attend a 2-year or 4-year college or university, the percentage of those, and they do some breakouts by certain demographics. And as registered apprenticeship in our state, as we see it as and also a great path after high school, we wanted to make sure that we are accounting for those individuals who aren't going to the 2-year and 4-year, but are taking that registered apprenticeship path, and including that in the data, so that we can see how that school is doing as far as this is still a successful process or program and path. So that's one reason we like to include that, so we can get a track on that, and also similar to where we are looking at that post-secondary register looks at enrollments. We consider this to be similar to an enrollment of that to a college, or a 2-year college, or 4-year college. So that's why we've included that. It gives us a better picture of what's actually happening to an additional segment of the population after high school.
Thanks. And you're doing, some other interesting research and policy things with all of this apprenticeship data, right?
Yeah, as we kind of talked about Future Ready Iowa, our attainment goal, and it being part of that initiative. We've also received a grant from the Department of Labor to expand registered apprenticeship in Iowa, and for us to keep metrics on that and keep track of how successful we are being, this data helps us do so. And we want to make sure that we are focusing in on those underrepresented populations with Future Ready Iowa and our registered apprenticeship grant. So we are creating dashboards as the one you see now that has, we're able to filter out, look at certain age groups, individuals with disabilities, sex, race, ethnicity, veteran status. All these are groups, and gender. Getting more women into registered apprenticeships is also a goal of ours. So this allows us to monitor how successful we are being in our state in those terms. We are also including doing some work with our Department of Corrections system. We have registered apprenticeships in the Department of Corrections system, and so we're working with them to look at how successful those returning citizens are in finding work after they've completed their registered apprenticeship with that sponsor, which would be the Iowa Department of Corrections. And it's as a way to, hopefully provide gainful employment, and then reduce our recidivism in our state. So we're working with them. I mentioned the state longitudinal data system. We're also using the data to help with our outreach as we're trying to increase the registered apprenticeships in Iowa. Providing data to possible apprentices gives them more information, and as a consumer to decide what they're going to do, which path they're going to take. That is very helpful for us when our staff and our field offices are working with job seekers and people who are doing some career exploration. We've had numerous data requests from whether it's our legislator, our governor's office, or just senior administrative or executives within our own agency, that this data has been very helpful to answer.
Thanks. So I want to move on. Dave has been on the line for a while and hasn't had a chance to speak yet. So to set the stage, Washington is a state apprenticeship agency state. It's not, it collects its own data, but Dave, you're not from, the state apprenticeship agency entity. Sure. You're actually from, so I want to hear about this from your perspective. I think, Iowa just talked about how they share their data with their state longitudinal data system, and that enables them to do a lot of really fantastic research. And so I think it'll be interesting to hear from you, what data is collected in Washington, kind of what data you have.
Sure.
And then talk about, how all of that data sharing is done in Washington State and what you've actually been able to do because you're sharing that apprenticeship data.
Okay, sure. So I'm Dave Wallace. I'm the research director with Workforce Training Board. I'm sorry? Hello?
Yep.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm with the Workforce Training Board. As Jenna mentioned, we don't actually collect the data ourselves. Our Labor and Industries Agency does that. They get from sponsors. They get classroom hours and on-the-job training hours, and then they give us Social Security numbers. We then match that, and we can get the outcomes such as employment, earnings. You can even pull up information like what industry were they working on and so forth. And also in the state of Washington, we have hours. In addition to that, we do have a state longitudinal data system that, independent of what we do, gets that similar information from our Labor and Industries Agency. And what they can then do is connect that to educational data, and they can look at it over long term, what sort of outcomes we get. So that's kind of the general overview of our data. It mostly involves data sharing agreements. I know that the longitudinal data system, they've only been in existence about 10 years. And I reached out to them, I asked them, and basically the response they said is there was nothing special about getting the data sharing agreement. They had previous relationships with them, and so it was fairly routine to just get that. And similarly, my agency, the history of getting the data, the apprenticeship data, long time predates me. When I asked here how long it's been, the answer I got was since the last millennium. We've been getting this data from Labor and Industries. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, so can you show a little bit about some of the research that your agency's been able to do with this apprenticeship data?
Sure.
For those on the group, I think there's some screen sharing happening. So it's going to take a minute to get that together.
Okay, can everybody see it?
I can, yeah.
Okay. So this is a dashboard that we have. It's current as of what we call the program year 15-16, and you can see we actually administer this evaluation of 12 different programs across the state, not just apprenticeship. And one of the reasons that we do that is that we're mandated by our legislature, because they wanted us to have apples to apples comparison, so that you can look at how apprenticeship compares to, say, WIOA programs. You can see here on this page. We have, in that particular year, there was nearly about 1,500 participants. You can see the state expenditures were just over $2 million. You can also see we have historical earnings and employment rates. In addition, we can drill down and get more data here. So it'll take just a moment. We can get, for example, demographic data. And this is, I forgot to mention, demographic data, that's one of the things we do get from our apprenticeship agency. You can see gender, you can see ethnicity, age at registration, and education. A number of different close-ups along here. But so anyway, that's the data that we show here. We've also done, we're also mandated to do a cost-benefit analysis study, and from that we can look at things like return on investment. So we've, for example, found that for the state of Washington, when compared with a similar group of individuals, there's a return on investment of $71 to $1. And the average additional earnings for those that have been through apprenticeships on an annual basis are about $14,000. So there's a lot of information out there that you can show the benefits of apprenticeships.
And I think that's an interesting point. So I'm looking at this and I'm seeing all this information broken down by demographics, and I'm thinking a lot about the National Skills Coalition Network. Obviously, it's a lot of advocates, a lot of people that are on the ground, and this information is available to whichever of them are in Washington. And so I think in other states, we see when there's tools like this, advocates can look at this information, get a better sense of equitable attainment, equitable policies. And I know in Washington, I'm not sure who this effort was led by, if it was the advocacy community or not, but I think there has been, based on, the really strong outcomes that you just listed, some interesting policy changes and like moves towards more apprenticeships, right? Can you just talk about that briefly?
Sure. So we have an apprenticeship council in the state, and one of the things that they've done, they actually require sponsors to give feedback in terms, for example, they set goals based on gender and ethnicity, and they require feedback, and they actually can sanction sponsors if they fail to meet these goals. So there's a real strong push toward that kind of equity in the state. There are also a number of nonprofits, for example, that are pushing both toward gender equality and ethnicity equality, as well as there's a whole lot of efforts in the state to move away from, like all states, I think we're traditionally construction concentrated, but there's a real strong push to get into things like healthcare, and in our state, IT is such a critical industry, so there's a big push there as well.
And I think even in Washington, looking back on this a couple of years ago, and this might be outside of your realm, but I think they gave a bunch more money to apprenticeship programs in the state after looking at the outcomes, right?
Yeah, that's my understanding. Yeah, and it's right now there's a real strong push from our governor. He actually organized a tour to a group that went to Switzerland to look at the model they have there. And so he came back, and at the time the ambassador of Switzerland has since come back and is the head of our employment agency. And so there's this real high-level strong push to increase apprenticeships in the state. And in the Swiss model in particular, you're looking at expansion well beyond those traditional occupations.
So I do want to be mindful of time and make sure that we have a chance to answer everyone's questions. But Dave, do you have any more information that you want to share with the group before we move forward?
I think I've covered most of what I wanted to talk about, but I certainly welcome any questions.
Okay, then if we can go back to the slides, we'll wrap it up and move to some questions. Again, if you have a question you want to ask, there should be a Q&A box towards the bottom of the screen where you can ask your questions, and we'll try to have those answered. We'll have WDQC's Director Brian Wilson do the facilitation of those questions and answers. So just to wrap up, I think I hope that it's clear to all of you today. I think we all probably knew this somewhat inherently, but the data really does show that apprenticeships have strong workforce outcomes. They're in line with employer demand, and they're a great way of ensuring that our workforce is going to be trained. So I think it makes sense if you're a state that doesn't already to include this within your post-secondary attainment goal. And our panelists from Iowa, from Washington have discussed a little bit about how that happens. And if you're interested in learning more, of course, they're happy to take more questions as it goes on. I think the other thing that's interesting about this conversation that we hope you take away is that once you include this data in your state longitudinal data system, you get a lot of that research that, say, Dave just showed. You can figure out what percentage of apprentices are women or people of color, and you can see those outcomes if they're equitable. If you're an advocate, you can look at this information and better understand essentially how, what programs you want to be promoting and what you want your legislature to support. So I think all of that's really, it's good information for people to have. It makes sure that we're not just supporting programs blindly, but really supporting programs that work. And ultimately, data is going to be what drives policy. So next slide. Just to finish up, we do have a paper about this topic. So if you'd like more information about counting registered apprenticeships within your state's post-secondary attainment goal, you want a little bit more detail about how to get this data, as have Iowa and Washington, you can visit nationalskillscoalition.org/resources/publications to read the paper called Counting Registered Apprenticeship Completions that just came out a couple weeks ago. So we're going to move to question and answers, and I'd like to introduce Brian Wilson, who's the Workforce Data Quality Campaign Director, to start asking our panelists some questions.
Thank you, Jenna. So we received quite a few questions actually through the chat feature. All those have actually been directed to Greg and were questions that were specific to the RAPID system, and Greg has been responding to those questions using the chat feature throughout. There have been a couple additional questions that were entered through the Q&A box, which I'd like to now refer to our panelists. The first of these questions is for Greg. Well, Greg, today's webinar, we focused on registered apprenticeships. We did receive a question about the new industry-recognized apprenticeship programs. I don't know, but is there anything at this point that you can say about the department's plans to collect data on the new industry-recognized apprenticeship programs? Data about the programs and data about their results. Is anything set at this point for those new programs?
I will say this, the information we have on that new program, the best available source for the latest information is our apprenticeship.gov website. We are currently in the process of clearing the collection of accreditor applications. The form for accreditors to sort of become part of that program. Data and other collection pieces of that program will be addressed in regulations that will be coming out hopefully sooner than later, but I don't have a date for those. So that's to be sort of be spelled out for in the future. I don't really have much I can say on it at this time.
Okay, thank you, Greg. Then a question for Ryan and Dave. There's a lot of data available now about the strong labor market outcomes of apprenticeship programs. Have your states engaged in efforts, particularly in getting this information out to the public, getting this information out to career counselors, guidance counselors in the schools, career counselors at the American One-Stop Job Centers or elsewhere? Have your states been getting this information out about the strong results of apprenticeship programs?
Sure, I could answer. This is Dave. I would say we make the information available, and you gave that list of various places that we can make it available to, and I think we do a better and worse job depending on which entity you're talking about. Thinking particularly like on the career counselors, I think in our state we have something like 300 school districts. And so they all have a fairly high degree of independence, and so I think we're at the stage where we acknowledge that it's really critical that we reach out to them, because there's a traditional emphasis on the 4-year degrees among career counselors, and so I would say that we're at the stage of being very aware of the problem, but I don't think we've got a solution to that problem.
This is Ryan in Iowa, and we have reached out to school counselors. What's nice for us is we also have the registered apprenticeship grant from the Department of Labor that I mentioned. So we have a registered apprenticeship coordinator inside of our agency that has been with us for, I believe, almost 2 years. And so she has been traveling the state, and last month just presented at the Iowa School Counselors Association annual meeting, and has been working through our field offices that we have, I think 17 or 18 different offices with workforce advisors that they've been explaining the benefits of registered apprenticeship and making that a priority. And then also from which is kind of out of the ballpark of my division and what my staff work on, we work with a tool called Career Coach. It's a tool that typically only connects job seekers and career explorers to 2-year and 4-year colleges and universities. Well, we've actually customized that tool to include registered apprenticeship sponsors. So if an individual or student was going to get more information about becoming what an electrician does and what that job's growing or declining, and who provides training for that. Now in Iowa, they will see the sponsor of ABC electrical if they're within 50 miles of that person's search or something like that. So I think we would agree we can do more, but we're trying to get out there and let the people who are making the decisions and helping the people that are helping these people make decisions be aware of these opportunities.
Thank you. So one of our listeners suggested that states reach out to their state career development association, and there's also a National Career Development Association as a good way to reach out to career counselors. A question for Greg. You talked a little bit about this, but I think maybe you could clarify a little more in terms of the data that's posted on your website. To what that data is limited to only the apprenticeships that are registered with the Department of Labor, as opposed to being data that is also inclusive of the state apprenticeship agency states?
Well, the data we put on our website that I presented really briefly, I know it gets overwhelming real quickly. The national data includes all the data from our RAPIDS system for those states that participate in RAPIDS, plus those state agencies such as Washington that provide us their aggregate counts. So what I present on our website are those aggregate counts we receive for all states, that we have for all states. What I don't get for all states are things like demographics and some of the more detailed information. There are currently 14 states that do not participate in our case management system. And so because I don't have all that rich individual data, I can't build a rich national picture at this time. We are working with those 14 states to get their individual record data, non-PII individual record data, in which to build a richer national database of information so that we can paint a better picture of the apprenticeship world and post that on our website. So I'm working with the states currently. We're talking to them on an individual basis, those states that don't participate in our system, to see if we can come to a common grounds on the provision of that individual record data, really so that we can paint a better picture of that registered world.
Okay, thank you, Greg. Those are the main questions we have, and we are getting close to the hour, so I'm going to turn it back to Jenna to close it out.
Thanks, Brian, and thank you all for being with us today. Again, if you want to see more information about any of this, you can go to the National Skills Coalition website and look at our Counting Apprenticeship Completions paper that has a little bit more detail about what our panelists delved into today, particularly on the data side. And if you have more questions, if you hang up from the line and think of a question, feel free to email me. It's jennal@workforcedqc.org, and I can try to get those questions answered for you. Again, I want to thank our panelists today, Greg Wilson at the U.S. Department of Labor, and Ryan Murphy from Iowa, and Dave Wallace from Washington. You were all fantastic, so thank you again for joining us, and thank you to our panelists. Have a great afternoon, everyone. Bye.